At 11 o'clock on the morning of December 19, 1944, Lieutenant General George Patton sat in a cold stone building in Verdun, France, watching the faces of the most powerful military commanders in the Western world go pale with fear. The room was a former French army barracks, hastily converted into a conference space. The walls were bare stone. A single pot-bellied stove struggled to heat the frigid air. Outside, the temperature hovered near freezing. Inside, at least 16 officers, 12 Americans and 4 British, sat around a long wooden table, their breath visible in the cold. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had called this emergency meeting. He arrived at 11 that morning in an armor-plated Cadillac, accompanied by British Air Marshal Arthur Tedder. The men assembled represented the combined military might of the Western Allies. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, Lieutenant General Jacob Devers of the 6th Army Group, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Major General Harold Bull, Major General Kenneth Strong, the Chief Intelligence Officer, British Air Marshal James Robb, and Patton, commanding the 3rd Army. Notably absent was Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had refused to attend, sending his Chief of Staff in his place. The mood in that room was grim. These were men who had planned the liberation of Europe, who had overseen the largest amphibious invasion in history, who had watched their armies push the Germans back across France. Now, just 6 months after D-Day, everything they had accomplished seemed in jeopardy. 3 days earlier, the German army had launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. Operation Wacht am Rhein, they called it. Watch on the Rhine. More than 20 divisions in the initial assault, with additional forces committed as the battle developed. Over 200,000 men, more than 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles. The Wehrmacht had smashed through thinly held American lines at 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, and was now racing toward the port of Antwerp. If they reached it, they would split the Allied armies in half. The British and Canadians would be cut off in the north. The war that everyone thought was nearly won could be lost. Eisenhower tried to lift spirits. He told the assembled generals that the present situation should be regarded as an opportunity, not a disaster. But everyone in that room knew the truth. American forces were being overrun. Entire divisions had been shattered in the initial assault. Communications were disrupted. Command structures had collapsed. Units that had been resting and refitting in what was supposed to be a quiet sector were now fighting for their lives. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne, a critical crossroads town where 7 major highways converged. Without reinforcements, they would be annihilated. The 82nd Airborne was holding the northern shoulder of the German penetration at tremendous cost. Small units of American infantry and armor were making desperate stands at road junctions and river crossings, buying time with their lives. The question Eisenhower needed answered was simple. How fast could someone get there? He turned to Patton. How long would it take to disengage the 3rd Army from its current fighting and wheel north to relieve Bastogne? Patton did not hesitate. He answered that he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went silent. Several officers exchanged skeptical glances. One staff officer later recalled that the statement almost knocked him out of his chair. What Patton was proposing was considered impossible by every accepted standard of military planning. His 3rd Army was currently engaged in heavy fighting near Saarbrücken, over 100 miles to the south. These were not garrison troops sitting idle in comfortable billets. They were in active combat, locked in bloody fighting along the Siegfried Line, moving an army of 250,000 men, with all their tanks, artillery, trucks, and supplies, pivoting them 90 degrees in the middle of winter, over icy roads, through sub-freezing temperatures, reorganizing their supply lines, shifting their communications networks, and then launching a coordinated offensive against the most powerful German attack of the war, all in 48 hours. This defied every principle of military science. Staff colleges taught that such operations required weeks of preparation. The Germans themselves, masters of mobile warfare, had taken longer than that to prepare their own offensive. Eisenhower initially responded with skepticism. "Do not be fatuous, George," he said. But Patton insisted. He told Eisenhower that as soon as the meeting was through, he could attack the day after tomorrow morning. What nobody in that room fully understood was that Patton had already anticipated this moment. While other commanders had dismissed intelligence warnings about a German buildup in the Ardennes, Patton had paid attention. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been tracking German troop movements for weeks. On December 9th, exactly 1 week before the German offensive began, Koch had sent a report to Supreme Headquarters warning of the continuing buildup of German forces east of the 8th Corps area. He had identified armor concentrations, ammunition dumps, and 226 trains detected moving on a single day in November. The report was largely ignored by higher command, but Patton did not ignore it. On December 12th, 4 days before the German attack, Patton had directed his staff to make a study of what the Third Army would do if called upon to counterattack such a breakthrough. His officers worked through the night, preparing 3 separate contingency plans. Each outlined a different route north, a different configuration of forces, a different timeline for attack. Patton gave them code names: nickel for an attack from Arlon to Bastogne, dime for an attack against the tip of the Bulge, cent for an attack north through Diekirch towards St. Vith. By the time the German offensive actually began, Patton's staff had already wargamed multiple scenarios. Supply officers had identified stockpiles that could be redirected. Route planners had mapped the roads. Communications specialists had prepared new command frequencies. The Third Army was ready to pivot before anyone else even understood what was happening. When Patton left the Verdun meeting, he walked to a telephone and spoke 2 words to his chief of staff: Major General Hobart Gay, play ball. Within minutes, the prearranged code words were flashing down the chain of command. Units already on alert began their movement. 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, the 80th Infantry, and the 26th Infantry, started their northward march. The largest and fastest army pivot in military history was underway. What happened over the next 7 days would cement George Patton's reputation among the German high command. Here is an important distinction that historians have noted. During most of the war, German military records barely mentioned Patton. Their intelligence files contained only passing references to an energetic and responsibility-loving commander. It was only after the Ardennes and after Germany's defeat that German generals, in post-war interrogations and studies, would articulate their deep respect for what he had accomplished. The German generals who fought against Patton in World War II had seen everything. They had conquered Poland in 27 days. They had brought France to its knees in 6 weeks. They had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, reaching the gates of Moscow. They had fought the British in North Africa and the Soviets at Stalingrad. They had defended Fortress Europe against the greatest amphibious assault ever mounted. These were not men who were easily impressed. They had faced the best commanders the Allies could produce and had usually found them wanting. British generals, they felt, were too methodical, too cautious, too wedded to set-piece battles. American generals, they initially believed, lacked experience and sophistication. Yet when the war ended and American intelligence officers interviewed the captured German commanders, a remarkable pattern emerged. These interviews were not casual conversations. They were part of a systematic effort by the United States Army to learn from its enemies. German generals were brought to special facilities, treated with professional courtesy, and asked detailed questions about strategy, tactics, and their assessments of Allied leadership. The resulting reports, known as the Foreign Military Studies Program, would influence American military doctrine for decades. And again, when asked about Allied generals, the captured Germans singled out one name as worthy of particular respect. General Gunther Blumentritt had been one of the key planners behind the German invasions of Poland and France. He had served as chief of staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt throughout the war in the West. He understood German operational doctrine at the deepest level. In a post-war assessment prepared for the United States Army, Blumentritt wrote that they regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. He even improved on Napoleon's basic principle of activite, vitesse, activity, and speed. Blumentritt was saying that Patton understood warfare the way the Germans understood it. He grasped intuitively the principles of speed, shock, and exploitation that had made Blitzkrieg so devastating. Alfred Jodl had served as Hitler's chief of operations from 1940 until the end of the war. When American interrogators asked Jodl about Patton, his response was direct. He told them that Patton was the American Guderian. He was very bold and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes. The comparison to Heinz Guderian was the highest compliment a German officer could pay to a tank commander. Guderian had literally written the book on armored warfare. To call someone the American Guderian was to place them in the first rank of practitioners of mobile warfare. Guderian himself added his own assessment after Germany's surrender. He told his Allied captors that from the standpoint of a tank specialist, he must congratulate Patton for his victory since he acted as Guderian himself would have done had he been in his place. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had commanded German forces in the West through most of the war. He had planned the invasion of France in 1940. He had commanded the defense against the Normandy landings. He had led the Ardennes offensive. No German officer had faced the Western Allies longer or understood their capabilities better. According to Blumentritt, Rundstedt viewed British Field Marshal Montgomery as overly cautious, habit-ridden, and systematic. But Patton was different. In a post-war interview, Rundstedt stated simply that Patton was their best. But this reputation was not built without cost, and the path to greatness nearly ended before it truly began. To understand what made Patton different, you have to understand where he came from. George Smith Patton Jr. was born on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, into a family with deep military traditions. His grandfather had been a Confederate colonel mortally wounded at the Third Battle of Winchester in 1864. His great-uncle, Waller Tazewell Patton, had been mortally wounded leading the 7th Virginia during Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. From his earliest years, Patton was raised on stories of martial glory. He attended the Virginia Military Institute for 1 year before transferring to the United States Military Academy at West Point, from which he graduated in 1909. In 1912, he represented the United States in the modern pentathlon at the Stockholm Olympics, finishing 5th overall. The following year, he studied swordsmanship in France under a Master of Arms and designed a new cavalry saber that was adopted by the United States Army. In 1916, he served under General John Pershing during the punitive expedition into Mexico, pursuing the revolutionary Pancho Villa. It was during this campaign that Patton experienced his first combat, leading an automobile-borne attack on a ranch where 3 of Villa's men were killed. Patton strapped the bodies to the hoods of his cars like hunting trophies. The incident made national headlines and earned him the nickname Bandito. When America entered World War I, Patton established and commanded the first American tank unit to see combat. He led his men into battle at Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where he was wounded by a machine gun bullet that passed through his leg. He refused evacuation until the objective was secured. Between the wars, he studied, prepared, and waited. He read German military theory voraciously. He consumed the works of Clausewitz and the Prussian General Staff. He studied Rommel's book on infantry tactics. He read Guderian's writings on armored warfare. He did not just learn about German methods. He internalized them, made them part of his own thinking. George Patton's journey to becoming the most respected Allied commander among his enemies began not with a victory, but with a disgrace. In August of 1943, Patton was at the height of his fame. His 7th Army had just conquered Sicily, racing British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to the strategic port of Messina. American newspapers hailed him as a hero. His face appeared on magazine covers across the country. He seemed destined for even greater commands. Then, on August 3rd, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Sicily. Walking through the ward, he encountered a young private named Charles Kuhl sitting on a supply crate. Kuhl had no visible wounds. When Patton asked what was wrong, Kuhl replied that he guessed it was his nerves. He could not stand the shells. Patton exploded. He had no tolerance for what he saw as weakness. He called the soldier yellow-bellied. He slapped him across the face with his gloves. He grabbed him by the collar and dragged him toward the entrance of the tent, shouting that he did not want cowards stinking up a place of honor. The medical staff watched in horror. A nurse tried to intervene but was restrained. 1 week later, on August 10th, Patton did it again at a different hospital, the 93rd Evacuation Hospital near Santo Stefano. This time the soldier was Private Paul Bennett, a gunner who had been in combat continuously for weeks. Bennett had watched his best friend get severely wounded just days before. He was suffering from battle fatigue, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. When Patton approached and asked why Bennett was there, the soldier began to cry. He said he could not help it. His nerves were shot. Patton flew into a rage even more violent than the first incident. He slapped Bennett, pulled out his pistol and waved it at him, and screamed that he ought to shoot Bennett himself. He called him a disgrace to the army and to the men who were dying at the front. The medical officers present were appalled. The chief surgeon of the Second Corps wrote a detailed report of what had happened and sent it up the chain of command. Within days, the reports had reached General Eisenhower in Algiers. Eisenhower was furious and conflicted. Patton was his friend. More importantly, Patton was one of his most effective commanders, perhaps the most effective he had, but this behavior was inexcusable. Eisenhower sent Patton a blistering letter on August 17th, stating that he clearly understood firm and drastic measures were at times necessary to secure desired objectives, but this did not excuse brutality, abuse of the sick, or the exhibition of uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates. He must so seriously question Patton's good judgment and self-discipline as to raise serious doubts as to his future usefulness. Eisenhower did not relieve Patton. He could not afford to lose him, but he ordered Patton to apologize personally to the soldiers he had struck, to the medical staff who had witnessed the incidents, and to every division under his command. Patton complied, though the apologies were painful for a man of his pride. For months, the journalists covering the Sicily campaign kept the story secret. Nearly 60 American and British correspondents knew what had happened, but they believed Patton was too valuable to the war effort to destroy with negative publicity. They agreed among themselves to suppress the story. That changed in November 1943, when newspaper columnist Drew Pearson broke the story on his radio broadcast. The American public was outraged. Thousands of letters poured into Washington demanding Patton's dismissal. Congressmen called for investigations. The general who had seemed destined for glory now appeared finished. Eisenhower refused to fire him, but Patton was removed from active command. He would not lead troops into battle for nearly a year. The slapping incidents had cost him command of the invasion of Italy. They would cost him command of the D-Day invasion as well. Omar Bradley, who had served under Patton in Sicily, would lead the American ground forces in Normandy instead. Patton spent the first months of 1944 in a kind of professional limbo. He was too valuable to dismiss entirely, but too controversial to give a major command. Then someone realized there was a use for a general who was too famous to hide. In early 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, their greatest fear was that the Germans would discover where the landings would occur. The beaches of Normandy had been selected because they were less heavily defended than the more obvious target of Pas de Calais, the French region closest to England. But if the Germans learned the truth and concentrated their forces in Normandy, the invasion could fail. Operation Fortitude was the solution. It was one of the most elaborate military deceptions in history, designed to convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion would target Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. At the center of this deception was a phantom army. The 1st United States Army Group, known by its acronym FUSAG, was a completely fictional force supposedly stationed in southeast England, directly across the channel from Calais. On paper, FUSAG was enormous, larger than the actual invasion force preparing for Normandy. In reality, it existed only as an idea supported by elaborate stagecraft. Allied deception specialists created fake camps throughout Kent and Essex. They built temporary buildings that looked real from the air. They deployed inflatable rubber tanks that cast convincing shadows in aerial photographs. They constructed dummy landing craft from wood, canvas, and steel drums, mooring them in harbors where German reconnaissance aircraft might spot them. Radio operators transmitted scripted traffic between fictional headquarters, discussing troop movements, supply problems, and training exercises for an army that did not exist. And commanding this ghost army was George Patton. The choice was deliberate and brilliant. British intelligence had been intercepting and decoding German communications for years. They knew that the Germans had noted Patton's aggressive style in North Africa and Sicily. German intelligence had concluded that the Americans would never waste such an energetic commander on a secondary operation. By placing Patton in command of FUSAG, the Allies exploited German assumptions. If Patton was in England, preparing an invasion force pointed at Calais, then surely that must be the main attack. The Normandy landings, if they came at all, must be merely a diversion to draw German forces away from the real objective. Patton played his role perfectly. Though he chafed at being sidelined from actual combat, he understood the importance of the deception. He toured the fake camps and was photographed inspecting the dummy equipment. He gave speeches to real units that were secretly preparing to move to Normandy, ensuring that news of his presence in southeast England reached German ears. The Allies even used captured German officers to reinforce the deception. General Hans Kramer, a former commander in the Afrika Korps, had been captured in North Africa and was being repatriated to Germany due to poor health. Before his release, he was invited to dine with Patton and was driven through what he believed was southeast England, observing a massive invasion force. In reality, Kramer had been driven through southwest England. The army he saw was the real force preparing for Normandy. The road signs had been replaced with fakes pointing to towns in Kent. Everything Kramer observed confirmed that FUSAG was real and that the attack would come at Calais. When he returned to Germany, his detailed reports further convinced German high command of the deception. Double agents controlled by British intelligence fed a steady stream of false information to their German handlers. An agent codenamed Garbo, a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia who had volunteered to spy for Britain, was particularly effective. His reports on FUSAG were so detailed and so convincing that the Germans awarded him the Iron Cross for his service, never realizing he was working for the other side. Garbo's reports appeared in 62 German intelligence summaries. The deception worked beyond anything the Allies had hoped. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, Hitler was convinced it was a feint. The real invasion under Patton was still coming at Calais. He refused to release panzer divisions to reinforce Normandy. He kept the powerful 15th Army waiting at Calais for an attack that would never come. For 7 weeks, Hitler maintained his belief in Fusag's existence. The Allies had hoped their decoy plans might buy them 2 weeks. 7 was beyond their wildest expectations. By the time Hitler finally accepted that Normandy was the real invasion, the Allies had landed over 1 million men and established an unbreakable foothold in France. The German forces that might have pushed the Allies back into the sea had been held in reserve, waiting for Patton's Phantom Army. Operation Fortitude had saved countless Allied lives. But for Patton personally, the cost was bitter. While other commanders led men into battle, while the greatest amphibious assault in history unfolded on the beaches of France, he had commanded nothing but inflatable tanks and scripted radio broadcasts. He was desperate to get back into the real war. On August 1, 1944, Patton finally got his chance. With the Normandy beachhead secure after nearly 2 months of brutal fighting in the hedgerow country, Eisenhower activated the 3rd United States Army under Patton's command. The timing could not have been better. Operation Cobra, a massive bombing and ground assault led by the 1st Army under General Omar Bradley, had just blown a hole in the German lines near Avranches at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. American forces were pouring through a gap less than 5 miles wide. The entire German front was on the verge of collapse. Patton seized the breakthrough at Avranches with both hands. Within hours of taking command, he had armored columns racing in multiple directions simultaneously. One corps turned west into Brittany to capture the port facilities the Allies desperately needed. Another turned east, heading into the heart of France. A third pushed south to protect the flanks. What followed was unlike anything the war in Europe had yet seen. In the first month of operations, the Third Army advanced farther and faster than any army in history. His armored divisions swept across France like a flood breaking through a dam. They did not move in orderly lines with secure flanks and careful preparation. They raced forward on any available road, bypassing strong points, leaving pockets of German resistance to be mopped up by following infantry. Patton's forward commanders had standing orders to keep moving. If they encountered resistance they could not immediately overcome, they were to go around it. Delay was the enemy. Momentum was everything. An armored division that stopped to reduce a defended position lost the initiative that was its greatest weapon. The statistics from those weeks are staggering. In just 1 month, from August 1 to September 1, the Third Army liberated over 20,000 square miles of territory. They captured approximately 50,000 prisoners. They destroyed or captured over 500 German tanks and armored vehicles. They overran supply depots, airfields, and communications centers before the Germans could evacuate or destroy them. Cities that had been under German occupation for 4 years were liberated in a matter of hours. The psychological impact on the French population was electric. After years of occupation, after enduring the humiliation of defeat and the brutality of Nazi rule, they watched American tanks roar through their streets at speeds that seemed impossible. Villagers lined the roads, cheering and throwing flowers. Resistance fighters who had been hiding for years emerged to help. Information about German positions flowed to American commanders from grateful civilians who knew every road and hiding place in their regions. Individual units performed feats that seemed impossible. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's favorite, advanced 35 miles in a single day during the drive to Avranches, fighting all the way. Combat commands routinely moved 40 to 50 miles per day, maintaining combat effectiveness despite minimal sleep and constant action. Tank crews learned to eat, sleep, and conduct maintenance on the move. Infantry soldiers rode on tank decks or clung to any available vehicle, anything to keep up with the advance. Patton himself was everywhere. He traveled in a jeep or a small aircraft, appearing at the front lines without warning, checking on the progress of his units, relieving commanders who moved too slowly, praising those who took risks. His presence was electric. Men who had been ready to stop and consolidate found themselves pushing forward again. Officers who had been calculating cautious approaches suddenly found more aggressive solutions. The Germans could not understand what was happening. Their defensive positions, carefully prepared over months, were being swept aside in days. Units that had fought effectively against the British and Canadians simply disintegrated when Patton's forces appeared on their flank. Communication with higher headquarters was lost. Supply lines were cut. The orderly retreat they had planned became a rout. German commanders began sending alarmed reports up the chain of command. American forces were maneuvering more aggressively than anything they had faced since 1940. Their armor was moving faster, striking deeper, exploiting weaknesses with an almost instinctive precision. Standard defensive tactics that had worked for years were suddenly failing. Patton summed up his approach in a simple phrase. He said that his troops would hold the enemy by the nose and kick him in the rear, while conventional commanders pushed forward in straight lines, securing their flanks and maintaining solid defensive positions. Patton's forces flowed around obstacles, enveloped defensive positions, and struck where the enemy least expected. But speed meant nothing without logistics. This is where Patton's true genius emerged, and where he surprised even those who thought they knew him. The popular image of Patton was all dash and glory, cavalry charges and blood and guts, heroics. The reality was far more complicated. Patton understood logistics as thoroughly as he understood tactics. He knew that tanks without fuel were useless. He knew that infantry without ammunition could not fight. He knew that the most brilliant maneuver in the world would fail if the army that executed it could not be supplied. Other commanders viewed supply as a constraint on operations. Patton viewed it as a weapon. He pushed his logistics officers as hard as he pushed his combat units. His quartermaster corps became experts at anticipating needs, positioning supplies forward before the combat troops even arrived. Fuel dumps were established along projected routes of advance. Ammunition was stockpiled at key intersections. Food and medical supplies were pushed as far forward as possible. When official supply channels proved too slow, Patton's men became masters of improvisation. They liberated German fuel dumps and used captured gasoline to keep their tanks moving. They commandeered civilian vehicles to supplement their transportation. They stripped broken-down vehicles for parts to keep others running. They did whatever it took to maintain the advance. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system that supplied Allied forces in France, delivered hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies between August and November. But even that massive effort could not keep up with Patton's appetite for movement. His Third Army consumed supplies faster than they could be delivered. When fuel allocations fell short of his needs, Patton raged at Eisenhower and Bradley. He believed, with some justification, that supplies being diverted to support British Field Marshal Montgomery's more cautious advance in the north were being wasted. During the race across France, elements of the Third Army covered 150 miles in just 19 hours. This was not a reconnaissance patrol or an armored probe. This was an entire corps, with tanks, infantry, artillery, and support units, moving at a pace that would have seemed impossible to military planners just months before. By early September, the Third Army had reached the Moselle River, deep inside eastern France, closer to Germany than anyone had dared hope just weeks before. They had outrun their supply lines. Fuel was desperately short. Ammunition stocks were running low. The advance finally ground to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because the trucks could not bring enough gasoline forward to keep the tanks running. Patton was furious. He blamed Eisenhower for diverting supplies to Montgomery in the north. He believed that if he had been given priority, he could have crossed the Rhine and been deep into Germany before winter. The argument has been debated by military historians ever since. What is certain is that the pause gave the Germans time to recover. While the Third Army waited for fuel, the Wehrmacht reorganized. Fresh divisions arrived from Germany. Defensive positions along the Siegfried Line were manned and strengthened. The window of opportunity that had seemed so wide in August began to close. The Third Army spent the autumn of 1944 grinding through the fortresses around Metz and the rugged terrain of the Lorraine region. The city of Metz had been a fortress since Roman times. The Germans had fortified it further with a ring of massive concrete bunkers and artillery positions. Fort Driant, the strongest of these fortifications, had walls 30 feet thick and was defended by a garrison that refused to surrender. Patton's forces had to reduce these fortifications one by one. In bloody fighting that recalled the trench warfare of World War I, more than the mobile operations Patton preferred, the weather turned against them. Rain fell continuously through October and November. The Moselle River flooded, washing away bridges that engineers had labored to construct. The roads became rivers of mud, tanks bogged down, trucks sank to their axles. Infantry slogged through fields that sucked at their boots with every step. The clear skies that had allowed American aircraft to dominate the battlefield gave way to low clouds and fog that grounded the plains. For weeks at a time, ground troops had to fight without the air support they had come to depend on. Casualties mounted. The Third Army suffered over 55,000 casualties during the Lorraine campaign alone. Progress slowed to miles per week instead of miles per day. Divisions that had been at full strength in August were now operating at 60 or 70%. Replacements arrived, but they were green troops who needed time to learn the hard lessons of combat. Many did not survive long enough to learn. For a commander who believed in speed above all else, it was agony. Patton pushed his men relentlessly, driving them forward through conditions that would have justified a pause. He visited forward positions constantly, exposing himself to artillery fire and sniper attacks. He wanted his soldiers to know that he shared their hardships, that he would not ask them to endure anything he would not endure himself. Then came December 16, 1944. The German offensive hit like a thunderbolt. 20 divisions smashed through the American lines in the Ardennes. The thinly held front, manned by units resting from combat and fresh divisions still learning their trade, collapsed under the onslaught. Within hours, the Germans had created a bulge in the Allied lines over 50 miles wide. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to the critical crossroads of Bastogne, found itself surrounded. 7 major roads converged at Bastogne. Whoever controlled those roads controlled the movement of armies. The Germans knew it. The Americans knew it. The paratroopers of the 101st dug in and prepared to fight to the last man. On December 22nd, German commanders sent a formal surrender demand to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st. McAuliffe's reply became legend. A single word typed on a piece of paper: nuts, but defiance alone would not save Bastogne. The airborne troops needed relief, and they needed it fast. This was the situation Patton faced when he made his audacious promise at Verdun. 3 divisions, 48 hours, 90 degrees, 100 miles, in winter. The maneuver Patton executed over the following days remains one of the most remarkable military achievements of the 20th century. His army was not simply moving from one position to another, it was disengaging from active combat with the enemy, pivoting north, and then launching an immediate offensive, all while maintaining unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. Consider what this actually required. Divisions that had been fighting eastward for weeks had to break contact with German forces without triggering a pursuit. Artillery units that had been firing in one direction had to limber their guns, move north, and set up to fire in an entirely different direction. Supply convoys that had been delivering material along east-west routes had to be redirected onto north-south roads that were already clogged with traffic. The logistics were staggering. Over 133,000 vehicles and tanks had to be rerouted through winter slush, mud, and ice. Supply lines stretching back hundreds of miles to the Normandy beaches had to be completely reorganized. Fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and medical facilities had to be repositioned. Communications networks had to be reconfigured. All of this had to happen while German forces were actively probing for weaknesses. The Third Army moved through one of the worst winters in 50 years. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Snow fell continuously. Roads were packed with ice and clogged with retreating American units from the initial German breakthrough. Many soldiers had not been issued proper winter clothing because the Quartermaster Corps had not expected sustained winter operations. Patton drove his men relentlessly. He appeared at crossroads and choke points, personally directing traffic, shouting at drivers who hesitated, relieving officers who moved too slowly. His jeep seemed to be everywhere at once. Truck drivers who had already been on the road for 24 hours kept driving. Tank crews who had not slept in days maintained their vehicles and kept moving. Infantry soldiers marched through snowdrifts and freezing rain. On the morning of December 22nd, less than 72 hours after Patton left the Verdun meeting, the Third Army attacked. The 3rd Corps and 12th Corps struck northward on a 20-mile front. The Germans, who had expected weeks before the Americans could respond, were caught completely off guard. The fighting was brutal beyond anything the soldiers had experienced. German forces resisted with desperate fury, knowing that the success of their entire offensive depended on keeping Bastogne isolated. The roads north were narrow, often just single lanes through dense forest. German anti-tank guns covered every approach. Artillery zeroed in on the few bridges and crossroads. Every mile gained cost lives. Patton threw everything he had at them. The 4th Armored Division, leading the relief column, attacked through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day without pause. When Combat Command B bogged down at Chaumont, Combat Command R found another route. When that route was blocked, Combat Command A swung wide to the east. Patton kept pushing, kept probing, kept looking for any weakness in the German lines. On Christmas Day, 1944, Patton noted in his diary that it was a clear, cold Christmas. Lovely weather for killing Germans, which seemed a bit queer, seeing whose birthday it was. Despite the conditions, he made sure every soldier in the Third Army received at least a hot turkey dinner. Field kitchens operated in freezing temperatures. Supply trucks delivered food through areas under enemy fire. Patton understood that small gestures of care mattered to exhausted men far from home. The next day, December 26th, At approximately 4:50 in the afternoon, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion broke through the German encirclement. A Sherman tank nicknamed Cobra King was the first to make contact with the defenders of Bastogne. It was an M4A3E2 Sherman jumbo assault tank, heavily armored and bearing the bumper number C6 for Company C. The tank commander was First Lieutenant Charles Bogus. His crew consisted of Corporal Milton Dickerman as gunner, Private First Class James Murphy as loader, Private Hubert Smith as driver, and Private Harold Hafner as assistant driver. When Cobra King rumbled into the American perimeter, the exhausted paratroopers could hardly believe what they were seeing. Relief had actually come. 20 minutes later, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, and the future general for whom the M1 Abrams tank would be named, shook hands with General McAuliffe. The siege was broken. Cobra King would eventually find a home at the National Museum of the United States Army, preserved as a monument to that historic moment. But the battle was far from over. The Germans launched repeated counterattacks, desperately trying to retake the initiative. Fighting around Bastogne continued for weeks. Some of the heaviest combat of the entire battle occurred after the relief, not before. Patton's forces had to expand the corridor, push back German attacks, and eventually help close the bulge entirely. By the end of January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had been completely defeated. The Germans had lost over 100,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. They had expended their last strategic reserves. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace had instead accelerated Germany's collapse. American casualties were also severe. Over 19,000 killed, tens of thousands more wounded or captured. It was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II, but the outcome was never in doubt once Patton's forces arrived. The German High Command had gambled everything on speed, on reaching Antwerp before the Allies could react. Patton's impossible pivot had shattered that gamble. The psychological impact on German commanders was profound. They had watched an entire American army disengage from combat, wheel 90 degrees, move over 100 miles through winter conditions, and launch a major offensive, all in less than 72 hours. This was not supposed to be possible. The Germans themselves, masters of mobile warfare, would have considered such a maneuver extraordinarily difficult. General Erich Brandenberger, commanding the German 7th Army during the Ardennes offensive, later acknowledged that Patton had given proof of his extraordinary skill in armored warfare, which he conducted according to the fundamental German conception. The final months of the war saw the Third Army's reputation reach its peak. After the bulge, Patton's forces crossed the Rhine River in March 1945. They swept through central Germany, capturing territory at a pace that recalled the great advance across France the previous summer. On March 22, 1945, Patton's forces crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, south of Mainz. They did it without a massive preparatory bombardment, without weeks of planning, without the elaborate set piece that Montgomery was preparing farther north. Patton simply found a crossing point, pushed troops across, and expanded the bridgehead before the Germans could respond. The 5th Infantry Division began crossing between 10 and 10:30 that evening. When he called Bradley to report the crossing, Patton could not resist a boast. He told Bradley that the Third Army had crossed the Rhine before Montgomery without any aerial bombing, without any airborne assistance, without any amphibious equipment, and without a bloody engineering effort. For 1,000 years men had been crossing the Rhine, and now the Third Army was doing it again. A memorial at the site today calls it the first successful Rhine River assault crossing since Napoleon. The advance into Germany became a race. Patton pushed his divisions forward as fast as they could move. They overran towns before the inhabitants knew they had been captured. They liberated concentration camps, including Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, where Patton and Eisenhower walked through the grounds and saw the horrors the Nazis had inflicted. Patton was so sickened that he vomited. He ordered the citizens of nearby towns to tour the camp to see what their government had done. By May, the Third Army had driven into Czechoslovakia. Patton desperately wanted to liberate Prague, to reach the capital before the Soviets. But Eisenhower, following agreements made with Stalin at Yalta, ordered him to halt. Patton was furious. He wrote in his diary that he felt they should have gone to the Moldau River in Prague, and if the Russians did not like it, they could go to hell. The statistics for the Third Army's entire campaign are almost impossible to comprehend. From August 1, 1944, to May 9, 1945, a span of 281 days of continuous combat, the Third Army captured over 81,000 square miles of territory. They liberated or conquered more than 12,000 cities, towns, and villages. They crossed 24 major rivers. Most remarkably, the Third Army claimed to have killed, wounded, or captured over 1.8 million German soldiers, more than 6 times its own strength in personnel. While these numbers include some double counting of prisoners who were processed through multiple commands, and some historians have calculated lower figures, even conservative estimates place German losses against the Third Army at well over 1 million men. Third Army casualties during the same period were approximately 16,600 killed, over 96,000 wounded, and approximately 27,000 missing or captured. They had inflicted losses on the enemy at a ratio of better than 6-1. Patton himself did not survive long after the war. In the months following Germany's surrender, he was appointed military governor of Bavaria. But his outspoken nature, his contempt for diplomacy, and his controversial comments about denazification policy led to his removal from that post in October 1945. On December 9, 1945, his staff car was struck by a truck near Mannheim, Germany. The collision seemed minor, but Patton had been thrown against the front seat. He suffered a compression fracture of his cervical vertebrae and was paralyzed from the neck down. For 12 days he lay in a hospital bed, unable to move. The warrior who had driven armies across continents now unable to lift his own hand. On December 21, 1945, at 5:55 in the evening, George Patton died of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. He was 60 years old. He was buried on December 24, 1945, at the Luxembourg American Cemetery in Ham, 3 miles east of Luxembourg City. Among the men who had died serving under him during the Battle of the Bulge, he had requested to be laid to rest with his soldiers. His grave remains the most visited in the cemetery. Pilgrims come from around the world to pay respects to the general who, more than any other, embodied the American way of war, aggressive, mobile, and utterly relentless. The German generals who had fought against him offered their final assessments in the years after the war. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring noted that Patton had developed tank warfare into an art and understood how to handle tanks brilliantly in the field. He felt compelled to compare Patton with Rommel, who likewise had mastered the art of tank warfare. Both of them had a kind of second sight in regard to this type of warfare. General Fritz Bayerlein, who had served under Rommel in North Africa and later faced Patton in France and at the Battle of the Bulge, offered a telling comparison. Referring to the escape of the Afrika Korps after the Battle of El Alamein, Bayerlein said he did not think General Patton would have let them get away so easily. Perhaps the most succinct assessment came from von Rundstedt himself. When asked after the war which Allied commander he considered most dangerous, the German field marshal who had planned the invasion of France and commanded the Ardennes offensive gave a simple answer. "He is your best." The myth of Patton has sometimes obscured the man. He was not universally beloved, even by his own troops. His nickname, Old Blood and Guts, was given with some bitterness by soldiers who noted that it was always their blood and his guts. He was vain, profane, and capable of shocking cruelty, as the slapping incidents demonstrated. He held views on race, religion, and politics that were controversial even by the standards of his time, but none of that diminishes what he accomplished on the battlefield. In an era when warfare had become industrialized, when victory seemed to depend more on factories and supply chains than on generalship, Patton proved that leadership still mattered. The same divisions that performed adequately under other commanders became extraordinary under his. The same tactics that produced modest gains elsewhere produced spectacular breakthroughs when Patton was in charge. The German generals understood this. They had seen their own army transformed by commanders like Guderian and Rommel. They recognized in Patton the same quality, the ability to inspire men to fight beyond their limits, to move faster than the enemy thought possible, to turn military theory into devastating practice. The men who served under Patton have mostly passed now. The veterans who drove through the Ardennes in December 1944, who crossed the Rhine under fire in March 1945, who liberated towns and concentration camps, and helped bring the Nazi regime to its end, they are nearly all gone. But their accomplishments remain, etched in history and preserved in the memories of a grateful nation. The Third Army under George Patton captured more territory, took more prisoners, and inflicted more casualties on the enemy than any comparable force in the European theater. They did it through speed, audacity, and the relentless application of combat power. They did it because their commander demanded excellence and would accept nothing less. They did it because Patton made them believe they could do what others thought impossible. Today, visitors still travel to the Luxembourg American Cemetery to stand before Patton's grave, the simple white cross, identical to those of his soldiers except for the inscription of his name and rank, faces the rows of men who died serving under him. It is exactly as he would have wanted. A general among his troops, a warrior at rest with warriors. In the end, there can be no higher tribute from a defeated enemy. The Germans who faced George Patton across the battlefields of Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany knew exactly what they were dealing with. A warrior, a master of mobile warfare, the most dangerous man in the Allied armies, and they were right. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold histories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these stories that deserve to be remembered, and leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.